Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for another podcasting hour of greatness here on YouTube with, audio on Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, and iHeartRadio, and I'm going to work on getting on Spotify, because if it's good enough for Joe Rogan, it's good enough for me. And this week, we are going to talk critical thinking. I really feel like I should do more of these critical thinking themed episodes, being the critical thinker at large and all. But, critical thinking is a funny thing. It's absolutely vital and necessary to our life. It is a skill that is not an option in the internet age. But at the same time, I have to say, sometimes I feel a little dejected at the view count that I get on some of these videos, which is not any of the fault of any of you guys who are watching or listening right now, because you're the ones who are watching or listening. I'm just telling you that sometimes it gets a little frustrating because it is such a vitally important tool for our success in life. It's one of the few things that you can actually get into, learn valuable and useful skills that you can apply almost everywhere, almost uniformly. How you intake information, how you think about that information, how you process new information, merge it with old information, come to conclusions about things. I happen to think these are important skills to have. And while I might not always demonstrate them as well as some people would like me to, that's the other thing about it, is that it is also highly individual to us how we go about using these things, given our background, knowledge, culture, experience, etc. So this week, I am bringing on board somebody to help me explain and talk about some of this. And this is Dr. David Kyle Johnson. And I actually was introduced to him on another podcast I was on through another podcaster. And the first thing that struck me was that he seems to have a liking for the same things I like. You might notice in the background when he comes on screen that we have a thing about Star Wars and other such things. So he's instantly likable. He's also a professor of philosophy at King's College, and he earned his PhD at the University of Oklahoma. And his specialization is metaphysics, logic, and philosophy of religion. And he has also, get this, produced lectures and teaching materials for the Great Courses, which is pretty much the key sponsor for my show. So I thought that was awesome. And he has written books and done courses, and we're going to talk about some of that. So now I'm going to say Kyle, because you are alternately referred to as David or Kyle or Dr. Johnson. But let's say Kyle for the show here. Welcome to my show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Chris. Yes, absolutely. Call me Kyle. That's what I go by. I just publish under David Kyle Johnson because I thought it set me apart from other David Johnsons out there. Yeah, good to be on the show.
Awesome. And I do want to stress this Kyle, by the way, because if you Google him, you might run into the works of another author out there with the unlikely name. I mean, David Johnson is such a strange, unusual name that you might run into the works of David K. Johnson in looking at this. We actually we were laughing before the show because I Googled him and I said, "Oh, hey, so you wrote this and this?" And he was like, "No." And that was Google kind of mixing up names and stuff. So so make sure if you Google him and look for him online that you're looking for the right one.
Oh, yes. What was the book? It was yes. The Lavender Scare. The Lavender Scare is not my book.
That's right. Exactly. So, okay. So first off, how did you get into this field? What was it about it that interested you? Just so we get a little background on you and what you're about and how you approach this.
Well, that's a long story.
Let's get the Reader's Digest version.
Okay, so you could say it started with this man right here, Spock.
Okay.
Whenever I was a boy watching Star Trek, Spock was my favorite character on Star Trek, and I kind of, I strided to be logical like Spock, right? This eventually led to me studying philosophy in college. In my first philosophy class, logic was one of the first things that were brought up, and my professor actually did like, today we're going to talk about logic, and I was like, oh, this is going to be fun. But I soon realized that this is what I wanted to do, so I changed my major to philosophy and decided to try to become a philosophy professor. And I took logic and happened to be really, really good at it. And so it wasn't my concentration in grad school, but I did a lot of it. There's a lot of like predicate calculus and that kind of stuff in my dissertation. And but then I also took the teaching critical thinking whenever I got a job at King's College, and especially came across a book by Ted Schick called How to Think About Weird Things. At once I was at King's College and teaching critical thinking there, and it really had a big influence on me. And so I started using it in a number of different classes, and I just kind of got more and more involved and saw how it stuck into a bunch of different other things that I was studying. Really important for philosophy of religion, which is one of my big concentrations, and also metaphysics. Just kind of kept going and learning and doing more and publishing more on it. I ended up with a blog on Psychology Today called A Logical Take, where I try to implement critical thinking to memes and other stuff that's happening in the day, or stuff that you see on the internet or whatever. I just kind of became more and more passionate about it, and so it's incorporated into a lot of my classes that I teach now. My courses, for the great courses, like the big questions, which is sitting right there. I've got whole lectures dedicated to that stuff, and I use it consistently throughout. Like, I teach the basics of critical thinking early on, and then I use it consistently throughout the course to kind of show how it sheds light on philosophical topics. I recently published a chapter in a book on medical misdiagnosis and medical error, about how learning to think critically could actually reduce, using specifically a method of critical thinking called abduction, or inference of the best explanation, could reduce medical errors, like medical misdiagnoses and that kind of stuff. So it's just become a passion of mine, I guess, as I've realized how useful it is in so many different ways. And so I've tried to kind of, since popular culture and popular philosophy is something that a big part of what I do, of trying to bring philosophy out to the masses, as it were, seeing how important it is, I've tried to spread the word about its importance in my works, and of course in podcasts like this and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I hit on it. I think you might be aware of my background a bit in terms of my Scientology background and stuff. And I came across this this whole field, which I was completely ignorant of, literally my whole life. I really didn't quite. I mean, I knew that there were rhetoric and logic and debate classes and stuff like that in school, but beyond that, I never really connected it with real life, or with how people live their life on a day-to-day basis. It seemed very ivory tower academic kind of stuff, especially when you get into, like you referenced there, some of the equations and math of logic, and it's just like, symbolic logic and that kind of crap. You just go, okay, I don't understand any of this. I'm not. And how many of us are really math oriented anyway, right? And it's not like we think that way. So how is it that we're supposed to use that to think better? And it was all just very confusing. But then I got out of Scientology and stopped having other people do my thinking for me, and realized that I didn't want to jump into another cult. And so I needed to proof myself up against it. And the story goes, and I'll retell it here because it bears retelling, and I think you might be interested in this. I started looking online for, how do I avoid bullshit? Literally, I Googled it, how to avoid bullshit, right? Or how to spot a cult or something. And the first thing that came up was Carl Sagan, right? Baloney detection kit. And I was like, what's this? The baloney detection kit. I'd never heard of it before. And the only thing I knew about Carl Sagan was he was a guy who had done Cosmos when I was like 10 years old, and talked about billions and billions of stars, right? And I just never really connected him with a logical, critical thinker. And then I got his book, The Demon Haunted World, and my life changed. And it changed significantly. I mean, that was a big deal. And not that a new Bible or a new cult or something. It was instead, here's an invitation to think for yourself. here's an invitation to actually look at life objectively, or at least with a with the blinders off a little bit, with the idea that you can figure things out, that things can be understandable, and that we don't have to give in to our passions or our biases just because we're who we are. And that was pretty amazing. So so ever since then, I consider myself very fortunate to have stumbled on that. I've been all about critical thinking. So so yeah, I think we both have some common ground here, that we want to look at the world in a fairly, as faux objective way as we can, try to figure some stuff out, try to live lives that are based on facts and true things, as Matt Dillahunty likes to say. I want to believe in true things.
Right.
So I think we have common ground on that. That's why I was so interested in getting you on my podcast. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So when I teach logic, half the course is that mathy sentential logic, stuff. And you're right, we don't naturally think that way, but that's why we need logic to teach us to think that way. But I realized essentially what you did is that that's only useful up to a certain point. There's a lot of the world and a lot of arguments that kind of logic cannot handle. And so I switched. When I teach logic, I don't just do sentential logic. I do a kind of basic primer on it in the first half of the course. And the second half is really kind of a critical thinking. It's inductive logic, but I teach fallacies. I teach how to do and pursue the best explanation. I teach about the limits of our perception. I teach about how to draw analogies. I teach about, how to spot, errors in statistical arguments, that kind of stuff, right? But it's really, really critical thinking heavy. And not the kind of math stuff that you're kind of afraid of. Because the goal of the course really is to get the students to be able to handle, evaluate critically any argument they come across in the real world. And sentential logic's not good enough for that. It's good for like half of it, and then the other half you need this other set of skills. And so that's why I changed the logic course that I teach.
This is bringing so many questions to mind, and I'm just going to grill you as we go here, and let's sort of organically see where the conversation goes in a non-adversarial way. I'm really picking your brain, so many questions, and I guess I want to start with you mentioned that, okay, so you're teaching these skills in order to get people to be able to evaluate the information that they are receiving or that is being thrown at them, right? And this is the golden question. How do we do that so that we can establish truth, and come and maybe objective. I need to use the word objective truth, because of course there's these kind of goofy ideas running around these days that you have your truth, I have my truth. Truth is relative. There's no such thing as objective truth. And you just kind of go, okay, let's okay, come back down to earth. This mouse is red. That's an objective truth. Like there are such things, and we can know them, and we can, ferret them out from information we get. So I guess first off, I want to ask you, what do you think would be the single, if we were going to be super reductionist, because I'm all about reductionism.
Okay.
If we were going to be super reductionist, what do you think would be the top or the first principle or the first thing that you'd want to get across to people about good critical thinking?
All right. You put me on the spot a little bit here, but I think I can handle it.
I did. I totally did.
So, the most important.
And by the way, I did not actually intend to put you on the spot with that question.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
More than happy to edit the thinking process out here.
All good. Now, I think, though, that the answer, I think, is that, to put it simply, and then I'll explain what I mean by it, that we are not as trustworthy as we think we are. We are not as trustworthy as we think we are. And here's what I mean by that. Kind of three ways that we're not very trustworthy. One, our senses lead us astray way more often than we realize. We see things that aren't there, or see things different than they actually are. The way that we perceive the world is not exactly accurate. Our brain constructs a world for us to see in a way that makes sense to us, in a way that we expect the world to be, et cetera, et cetera. And we will often see the world in inaccurate ways. And similarly, a similar point to that would be that our memory is not nearly as reliable as we think it is. And so our memory can often be faulty. It can tell us false things. It can make us think something happened that didn't. It can make us not remember something that did. And so we have to be very careful about trusting our own perception and memory when we're trying to figure out what happened, because it's not nearly as reliable as we think it is. And so specifically, when you have hard empirical evidence that says X, but then your own memory or perception says, well, but not X, it's probably the case that the hard empirical evidence is right. You may think, well, I saw it for myself, so seeing is believing. No, it's not. Seeing is not believing. Very often, seeing will lead you astray, right? And so if you've got really good reason to think that what your senses or memory is telling you are faulty, go with the objective, verifiable, evidence. In a similar vein, so those kind of the fallibility of senses and memory kind of go together. The other thing is that and this maybe is the more important one. If you really ask me for a concrete one, maybe it might be this, is that our intuitive reasoning is not reliable. That what we think is common sense actually leads us astray. For a lack of a better term, essentially kind of what evolution gave us, what evolution gave our brains, are a lot of shortcut methods to getting to conclusions. And they are useful for survival in certain kinds of contexts. If you see a rustle, easy example, if you see a rustle in the bushes or something like that, it's good to automatically assume that that's an agent. It could be a danger and run the other way, right? But these shortcuts are good for survival, but that does not mean that they are actually good at getting us to the truth. And so one of the basics of critical thinking is realizing that your intuitive reasoning very often leads you astray. And what you have to do is learn how to fight that instinct, right? And also learn how to reason carefully. And careful reasoning takes a little bit longer. It's a little bit more laborious. It's sometimes a step process. It takes some research. It takes some effort, right? But that careful reasoning is not something that comes to us automatically. It is not instinctive. It is something that you have to learn how to do. And then when you learn how to do it, you have to realize that even though your instinctive reasoning might be saying such and such, you have to learn how to do and to trust careful reasoning to actually get you to the right conclusion, right? And so as an easy example, a lot of logical fallacies are fallacies that are a result of this instinctive reasoning. And the reason that we don't realize that they're fallacious, that they're bad reasoning, is because our instinct kind of tells us that they're good. Like that's instinctively the way that we reason, right? So easy example would be hasty generalization. A hasty generalization is when you take too small of a sample, right? Like you see a couple of things that are a certain way and they fit a certain category. And so you conclude that everything in that category has those properties, right? So it's really common in racism or something like that. You see a couple of people of a particular race, they act that way, so everybody in that race must act that way. That's a hasty generalization, right? And we do it with racism, we do it with statistics, we do it all the time to make these hasty generalizations. And instinctively, it seems right. Instinctively, we jump to that conclusion, and it feels like it is true, and we'll act on it, and it is not at all. That's why it's a fallacy, right? That is not at all. If you have too small of a sample size, you can't extrapolate from that to the whole because your sample size could be biased, it could be too small, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of reasons that are wrong with that, right? But instinctively, it seems right. Slippery slope fallacy is this way. I'm trying to think of instinctively, if we attack the person giving the argument rather than the argument itself, that's called the ad hominem fallacy, right? That feels like it should work, right? Like, oh yeah, well that guy's such and such, he's that kind of person, whatever. So the argument he gives is no good. No, actually, you have to evaluate the argument on its own terms, not based on the source of the argument, right? But instinctively, that seems right. And so one of the basic level, kind of lessons of critical thinking is to learn to not trust your instincts when it comes to reasoning, to learn how to reason carefully and then apply those lessons systematically and carefully when you learn how to, and then once you realize that, then you get into the lessons of all, how to do it. But that would be the basics of it, I think.
That is awesome. I so appreciate you breaking all that down like that. And one of the reasons that I appreciate it is because you literally just validated so many conclusions that I have come to over the years and looking into and studying this and psychology and sociology and watching how people act and behave and how they think. And I've said, but I've only come to these conclusions kind of tentatively. And it's just, it's just wonderful to hear a doctorate level philosophy professor tell me, oh no, you nailed it. It's not native to how we think.
Right.
It's not inherent to how we think. We did not evolve to discover truth. We evolved to survive.
Right.
There's a huge difference there, right? These are things I've preached. I've talked about this. And like I said, I was always a little tentative about it. I was always like, I'm pretty sure this is how it is, right? But and after enough of studying this, you definitely learn. Yeah, we are not logical creatures, and there is no part of what's going on up here that was intended to ferret out objective truth. It's not what this is about. This machine up here is a brilliant machine. It is probably one of the most complicated, brilliant machines in the universe that we are aware of.
Right.
And all of us have one,
right.
but it's not a truth detector.
Right. Right. It has to. Well, it can be, but it has to be trained to be.
Exactly. That was the other point that I was harping on always, is that you have to learn how to do it. If you think your natural, organic thought processes are adequate to get you through, understanding things and again ferreting out, objective truth, that ain't it. And the whole point of the scientific method, and I'll ask if you agree with me on this, is to put in place a series of steps that have been proven over and over and over again to be the sort of artificial construct you have to apply your thought processes to step by step by step in order to ferret out objective, what our best shot at ferreting out objective reality.
Yeah, so I got two things to say about that. One, and you're completely right. A really good example of that is double-blind placebo-controlled trials.
Yep.
Right? They are, the way that those are set up, right? The way that they're designed is specifically to guard against the way that our perception, our memory, and our instinctive reasoning can lead us astray, right? Instinctively, we think, well, if somebody has X and then they take Y and then they get better, well, Y cures X, right? Like instinctively, that's what we think, right? But that is a causal fallacy, right? Correlation does not necessarily entail causation. Variable nature of illness, placebo effect, other causes could be involved there. That one person taking it and then getting better does not at all prove that it works, right? But instinctively we think that. The double-blind placebo-controlled trial process is specifically designed to guard against that fallacious line of thinking and a whole bunch of other fallacious ways of thinking to make sure that we don't lead ourselves into thinking that something works when it doesn't, right? That something cures whatever when it doesn't. So because like this is why you blind it, to make sure that you're not subject to expectation bias and thinking people are getting better because you want them to get better. This is you double blind it because that can happen with both the patient and the person examining the results. There are just it's endless. Like there's so many different ways that we can lead ourselves astray that are guarded against by doing a properly controlled. And this is why you do peer review as well. Because even when you're trying to be careful, you can do things like p-hacking, you can mess with the data and that kind of stuff. And so you let others look at it to try to make sure that that kind of stuff didn't happen. So that's why not only is double-blind placebo-controlled trials needed, but they need to be replicated. Like they need to be peer-reviewed and they need to be replicated to make sure that there are other errors that haven't, seeped in. And so science in general, and specifically double-blind placebo-controlled trials are specifically, they're designed, they are structured, they are intended to guard against all the ways that we lead ourselves astray, including those instinctive ways of reasoning that evolution has put into us, right? And so the second thing I wanted to say is, so there's this interesting, is interesting the right word? There's this argument called the argument from reason that has been championed by C.S. Lewis and Alvin Plantinga in recent years, that essentially argues that science, evolution, naturalism is self-defeating because by realizing that we evolved, right, and thus that we are these evolved creatures, and that like all the mechanisms for reasoning are all just these mechanical things that go on in our brain, that essentially naturalism, evolution, science refutes itself, because it teaches us that the reasoning that led us to, embrace evolution, it's not reliable. It's based on this thing, but this thing isn't a truth detector. It's just for survival. And so it defeats itself. It suggests that reason is not reliable because it's only something that's a mechanism of the brain, right? And what these arguments fail to realize, admit, acknowledge, is exactly what we're talking about, right? There's two kinds of reasoning. There's the one that evolution gave us, this instinctive reasoning, and you're right, it isn't good for getting to the truth, right? It often leads us astray. It's only good for survival. But evolution has led us to have these complex brains. And these complex brains are able, not because it's survival value, just because they're so damn complex, and they're complex for other reasons, which have to do with survival value. But the complexity gives us this ability to do this other thing that evolution did not select for, right? But it's a spandrel. It's there nevertheless, right? And that is that careful reasoning is able to realize that the instinctive reasoning isn't very reliable, right? And it is able to develop methods of reasoning that guard against those unreliable things, and that is able to actually get to the truth, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. And so, and that essentially is what science is. That's what, in my opinion, science just is inference to the best explanation. It's abduction or inference to the best explanation. And that abduction is specifically kind of geared towards this kind of careful reasoning and guarding against the ways our perception leads us astray, et cetera. But that's what it's designed to do. And so that's what it's good at.
Exactly. And I should be even careful when I throw around terms like objective reality, because of course, our reality is pretty much perceived reality. I mean, real reality, the quote unquote theoretical objective reality, could be, wildly beyond our ability to perceive, in the same way we can't perceive ultraviolet or infrared. We just can't see it. You got to build tools to do that, to perceive those things. And there could be things we're not perceiving right now that are a crucial part of our reality, objectively speaking, but we're just not even aware of them yet. In the same way we didn't know about microorganisms until, Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope. Until it was around, it was just a nice theory. It was a crazy idea. It was a batshit crazy theory. It was something people laughed at other people about. Microorganisms. People I'm pretty sure, humans being humans, I'll infer that there was probably a career or two ruined because of that thinking, And here we are, knowing full well at this point, nobody questions it. Nobody has a real problem with it because we can prove it, but we needed that instrument to do it. So we always have to taper these conversations. I always have to sort of throw these things out there because I'm a big picture guy, and I like looking at the 300-foot view and acknowledging the fact that our 300-foot view might actually be only a very tiny part of what is objective reality. Now, that all being said, okay, let's get practical. We can see what we can see. We can experience what we can experience. So we have to find truth there wherever we can and however we can. And this process seems to be the evolved process that is that's produced the best results for us this far along. And as soon as the Enlightenment hits and some really bright guys put this stuff together, civilization takes off in ways that thousands of years of not a whole lot of progress, a lot of oppressed cultures, a lot of nonsense, a lot of violence, to our modern era within a couple hundred years. So clearly we are on to something that is very, very useful here. I wanted to get your feedback on the pushback I get from time to time. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I got two things I want to add to what you just said that
go ahead.
Are important, but save your question.
Yeah.
First has to do with the power of science. So I think that you are right in that the idea of microorganisms probably ruined a few careers before it came to be accepted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thing with the atomic theory of matter, the idea that all matter was made of tiny little particles. The same would be true of Einstein's relativity. And the same was definitely true of the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun.
Yes.
But I have to check with them on the history of the microorganisms to make sure. But I'm pretty sure about this, that this is true of atomic theory, and I know it's true of heliocentrism. That we came to accept these theories before we actually could observationally confirm them with a microscope for microorganisms, with an electron microscope with atoms, and then by observing parallax with heliocentrism. So before we were able to observe that, like, certain stars move a little bit as we orbit the Earth because their angle changes as we orbit, as we orbit the sun, our angle changes to them a little bit, so those stars exhibit parallax. Before we could observe that, there was no observational way to differentiate between heliocentrism and geocentrism. They made the same predictions about where we'd see the stars and planets every night. But we eventually came before, Bruno was burned at the stake and a few other people were arrested. We eventually came to embrace heliocentrism even before we could observe parallax, because science came to acknowledge it as the simpler explanation, because it just required circular orbits around the sun, and that was such a simpler explanation than retrogrades on retrogrades that geocentrism required. And so we came to accept it even before we could observationally confirm it with parallax.
Occam's razor.
Say again?
Occam's razor.
Yes, it was Occam's razor. Yeah, the simplest explanation of Occam's razor, right? And this is if you read Schick's book, which I teach out of, he articulates 5 criteria by which we differentiate the best explanation, and simplicity or Occam's razor is the number 4, essentially, or anything like that. But it's in the book. It's the 4th one. Same thing happened with atomic theory, and it wasn't just simplicity. It was the large amounts of empirical evidence we had, experiments coming out the way that we would expect them, the way that chemistry worked, and all that kind of stuff all made the best sense if atomic theory was true. And so we came to believe that atoms existed long before we could actually see them with electron microscopes. And my guess is the same is probably true with microorganisms, that the virus or the germ theory of disease was recognized as the best explanation for what caused disease before we had microscopes powerful enough to actually see those organisms, right? And so you're right that early on, people would think it was crazy or whatever, right? But that science is powerful enough, and then those criteria are powerful enough that you can come to accept the best explanation as true, even before you can directly observe the thing in question that you're hypothesizing. And that, in general, speaks to the power of science to reveal objective reality. So you talked about how there's the world as it really is, and then there's the world that we see, right? Kant called this the noumena and the phenomena. That there's this world down there, the world as it actually is, and then Kant thought we had these categories by which we interpreted the noumena, and that presented to us the phenomenal world of our senses and experiences, and we would divide it up into cause and effect and that kind of stuff, right?
That's very interesting. I don't know a whole lot about Kant, and that's the first time I've heard any kind of summary breakdown of some of what he was talking about.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating. The noumena phenomena stuff is fascinating. The categorical, the categories that he talks about are fascinating. But Kant thought that we were forever divorced from the noumena, that we could never know the world as it actually is. And I have argued, like I argued in my big questions course. I think that's where it comes up. Might come up in sci-fi too. That Kant was wrong about this, that we actually can know quite a bit about the noumenal world. Maybe not everything about the noumenal world. There's parts of it maybe that are forever beyond our grasp and that kind of stuff. But we can know things about the noumenal world through science. And a perfect example of this is, I'm going to throw this back at you a little bit. A while ago, you gave an example of something that was an objective truth. Do you remember what it was?
Remind me.
that your mouse is red.
Oh yeah.
You held up your mouse and said your mouse is red, right? So I'm going to challenge that a little bit. Your mouse is not actually red.
Right. It's what we perceive as red through.
Yes. Right. It's what you perceive it. Right. But if you think about so apparently you've heard this before, right? But if you think about the process of what's going on or whatever, the only thing that's actually red is your experience of the mouse. Right? Your experience is red, but the wavelengths coming off the mouse are not red. They're just photons, and the mouse itself is just got a molecular structure that reflects certain photons, et cetera, right? Technically speaking, the mouse is not actually red, right? But notice that we know that. We can't, even though you cannot help but when you look at that mouse, you perceive it as red. Thanks to science, you can actually know that it's not red, right? And so your instinctive way of viewing the world, oh yeah, the mouse is red. And for ordinary purposes, that works perfectly fine. But science can actually reveal that that instinctive way of knowing the world is actually wrong. And we can come to accept the actual way the world actually is, right?
Exactly.
Not red, and we fully understand what's going on with the wavelengths of light, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right?
And that addresses also another thing, which well, you're a professor of philosophy. It's certainly perfect to talk to you about this. Levels of truth. And I'd like to actually get your take on this, because this is something that was introduced to me a few years ago when I was studying Robert Sapolsky's online course on human behavioral biology. And he talked early on about buckets, that you can approach a problem from different reference points, from biology, from neuroscience, from genetics, from sociology. I mean, it's a matter of degree, maybe. It's also a matter of focus and concentration, or what tool set you're bringing to the problem. But you have these different levels or buckets in which knowledge exists and is framed a particular way based on how you're looking at it. And so we have, this is red in at a particular level. That is an absolute truth.
Right.
But at another level, as you brought up, not really.
Right.
Because you got to look at it from another set of factors or ways of interpreting the world.
Right.
And I think that's really important. And I think that enters, not understanding that is part of understanding reality or understanding our experience of the universe is itself a key point of critical thinking that, if not known, can introduce all kinds of confusions with people arguing what is and isn't truth without recognizing that the context in which, and the tool set with which you're bringing to the problem also matter as to what the answers are going to be.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways of even parsing out what that mean by the different levels of truth. Like, you could think in terms of different kinds of science, right? You've got like quantum mechanics at the bottom that's describing what's going on in the quantum mechanical world. And then on top of that, you got particle physics, right? And so particle physics will talk in terms of, electrons and photons and positrons and neutrons and that kind of stuff, right? Like the particles or the atoms and that kind of, right? Technically speaking, though, those don't really exist. It's all quantum wave fluctuations down here, right? But at a certain level, it's perfectly fine and true to talk about the interaction of particles, even though on a more kind of basic level, the particles really aren't there, right?
Exactly.
You could put chemistry on top of particle physics, right? And you can keep going up and up and up, and it's perfectly acceptable to talk in those terms in that context. And what they're saying is true as far as it goes. It just may not be the entire truth. You got to go kind of deeper down for the entire truth, right?
That's right.
I think it's Ed Giles has an article about when I talk about it in metaphysics, and I'm kind of pulling off my memory here, but he talks about personal identity in this way. We talk about persons and what it means for you to be the same person over time, and what a person is, and that when you examine these things philosophically, they start to kind of break down, and it turns out that you can't really make sense of exactly what a person is, and so maybe persons really are just kind of fictions. In the same way that there really isn't a separate object here besides my Rubik's Cube. There's a collection of atoms here put together in a certain kind of way. And that's all there is. There's not another thing called the cube, right?
Right.
In the same way, maybe persons are like that. But Giles makes this distinction between, if I'm remembering the terminology, like conventional speech and ultimate speech.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks it's perfectly fine to talk in terms of I and you and they and persons, and we talk about, and it's perfectly fine on an everyday basis to do that. But ultimately, such things don't exist. And so when you switch over to kind of philosophical, metaphysical, ultimate speak, right, you should kind of just exclude that. But it's perfectly fine in ordinary, in conventional speech to use that. And so in the same way, it's perfectly fine to conventionally say your mouse is red, right, as long as you acknowledge that when we're really digging down, that's not exactly what's going on, but it's perfectly fine. But
exactly,
science can reveal that objective truth.
Exactly. So it's not a matter that I'm not trying to make the point that truth is relative or there's no such thing as truth. That's a
Right.
place that some pretty nutty people have gone, and
Right.
it's not the right way to look at this or interpret this, because that there be dragons down that path. That leads to more confusion than it solves, and it's not a good way to go.
Yeah.
There is a reality. We exist in it. We are experiencing it. Now maybe
Yeah.
this is all a simulation. I'm sure you're familiar with simulation theory. It's
Chapter 20, chapter 24, exploring metaphysics. Chapter 8, I believe, in sci-fi.
There you go. So
no, chapter 13 in sci-fi. Chapter 13.
okay, good. Of course, the forbidden chapter 13. So simulation theory, right? So here's an idea, right? Maybe all of this is actually just a computer system of as we would understand it, and we're all plugged into some matrix somewhere, and our real bodies are somewhere else, and this is just a black box device anyway. So our brains could be in a container somewhere in a lab, and how would we possibly know? How could we possibly have any understanding of that? We couldn't.
No, we couldn't. Right.
We really couldn't, right? Depending on how perfect the system is that we're part of, right?
Right. Unless Morpheus shows up and unplugs you and shows you that, right? Like, other than that, from inside, you can't know.
That's right. So even within those, even within that kind of reality, we still exist in a system of rules, as they like to say in the Matrix, and that was spot on. There are certain rules here, and those rules are just how things are. Gravity, for example, right? And these are true things within the context and our understanding of, and the ultimate understanding is that's as far as we're going to be able to get within this closed system. So it's not that truth is just some nebulosity that nobody can ever really discover. It's no, it's not. That's not really the right way to look at it. And on that same vein, I wanted to ask you about your take on when you hear people talk about how science is just another religion. You hear this. I'm sure you've seen this, right?
Sure.
You guys are just dogmatic. You're just a bunch of science. You just take it all on faith. It's just that.
Yeah.
What's your retort to such comments?
So again, this is a theme. I got two things. One on the topic of whether we live in a computer simulation. If you're interested, I just recently was featured in an article about what would happen if that was revealed to be true. Like what would happen to all of us if we actually did learn that we lived in a computer simulation. So I'll send you the link for that, and you can link to it.
Yeah, I'd love to look at it.
And I mean, the short of it is, it might not be that giant of a revelation, because all you'd be learning is that the basic part of nature, the basic part of the world is different than you thought it was, but it already is different than you thought it was, right? Like it's all quantum mechanic weirdness down there, right? You just realize it's quantum mechanic weirdness running on a computer. Like
right. Exactly.
Right. So, secondly, the idea that science is a religion. This is something that Schick addresses in chapter 1, I think, of his book. The view is often called scientism, the idea that what the scientists are like, it's this religion, it's this just another way of viewing the world or whatever. And it's, I mean, we know that that's not true. If it was just another way of knowing, there was just another religion, then it would be no more reliable at getting to the truth than any other religion. But it is clear, like no other religion, no religion has led to technological advances. No other religion has let us, manipulate the world, reveal the nature of disease, and be able to save lives in that kind of way. It doesn't lead to objective knowledge about the objective nature of the world. No religion has been able to reveal that the mouse isn't really red and like actually prove that that's true, right? And so it's just kind of like, just given the track record of science, if it is just another religion, it's the only true one out there, right? Like it's the one that has actually gotten us to real truths and understanding of the world, right? But it's not a religion, because religions are based on faith, and science is not based on faith, right? Faith is belief without sufficient evidence, and everything that happens.
Sorry, I had myself on mute there. But Kyle, you've never seen an atom. You've never seen quanta. You don't know those things exist. You're just taking somebody's word for it.
Right. Well, sort of and sort of not. I have seen images of atoms from electron microscopes, right?
Oh yeah, those were
And
just doctored photos, right? I've seen pictures of Jesus too. So
right. And if we go that route, right, so then we have an equivocation on what faith is,
right.
right? So, like, faith is belief without sufficient evidence, right? Seeing a picture from an electron microscope of an atom is sufficient evidence. That is enough. Is it 100% proof? No, because the photo could be doctored. I could be living in a computer simulation. Aliens could be making me think that that's true, right? But those are not the best explanation for what I'm experiencing, right? For the evidence that I have, right? And at that point, you're basically just giving ad hoc excuses to save your theory from falsification, right? Like that's no different than somebody saying that we didn't fly to the moon because the photos were doctored. Well, experts looked at the photos and said they weren't doctored. Well, better experts doctored them. Like, you could do that all day. You can ad hoc your way into defending any hypothesis that you want, right? But by doing so, you don't show that it's true. You just show that your hypothesis is irrational, right? And so I do have good evidence for the things that science, and it's sufficient evidence for the things that science has shown to be true, right? But religion is, and boasts about the fact that is based on faith, that it is belief without sufficient evidence, right? And it takes pride in that fact, right? That it's belief without sufficient evidence. And as I argue if you're interested in this, the book's a bit old, but I edited the book on Inception and philosophy. And I have a chapter in there about faith where I talk about, essentially, I make the argument that faith is not a virtue. It is not something, because there's a lot of talk about faith and leaps of faith and that kind of stuff in Inception, right? And so I argue that faith is not a virtue. It is not something that you should strive towards, that you should try to emulate or whatever. And most people think this is true for most things, right? Christians don't believe that belief in Allah by faith is a virtue, right? Most people do not think that believing the earth is flat, despite all evidence to the contrary, is a virtue. And yet that is exactly what their faith is, exactly what you would have to believe that the earth is flat, right? Faith is only said to be a virtue when it's belief in the thing that you want other people to believe in.
Yeah.
Notice anything else, it's not a virtue.
That's right.
Right? But that makes faith as a virtue completely useless to defend anything, because all faith as a virtue really amounts to is just, you should believe like I want you to believe, right? Like that's like, if somebody says you should believe such and such, and you say, well, what's your evidence? You say, oh, I just take it on faith. Well, why should I believe it on faith? Faith is a virtue. What faith is a virtue there just means is that's something I think you should believe.
Exactly. It's hardly a solid concrete argument.
Right. And so, but by any definition of religion, science does not fit that definition at all. It is not based on faith at all. At best, the only faith claim that science makes is that the future will resemble the past. That if I clap my hands together and hear a sound, that the next time I put my hands together, I will hear a sound. Like I have to make that assumption, right? That the next time, it turned out, right, to be the case. And of course I could continue to do that, but we have Hume's problem of induction and that kind of stuff to show that you, ultimately this has to be an assumption that you make, that the future will resemble the past. There's no way to prove the future will resemble the past without assuming the future will resemble the past. And so at most, that's the one thing that science has to take on faith, is that the future will resemble the past.
Right, exactly. That in other words, that things are predictable.
Yes, right.
That the behavior will repeat.
That there's a kind of uniformity in like that it will repeat. That's kind of the easiest way to put it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Isn't that, I haven't read deeply of this, but isn't that one of Popper's criticisms of the scientific method, or at least a statement about that? I remember. Yeah,
I mean, this has been something since Hume. Hume has recognized what's called the problem of induction, that you can't prove induction, that the future will resemble the past without already assuming it, and so you just have to assume it, right?
Yeah.
Notice two things about this. One, to doubt this, to think the future will not resemble the past, is the definition of insanity. That is at least one kind of popular definition of insanity, right? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and thinking you'll get a different result.
Oh, right. That cute little saying that gets thrown around.
Yes.
Right. That's right.
Right. Like, right. I mean, to be a sane, functioning individual, you have to assume that the future resembles the past.
Right.
Right. And you couldn't even hold a conversation really with someone who thought the future didn't resemble the past. Right. It would be like, because they would just, everything that you said, they would just dismiss. They would just say, well, you don't know that. Like I put my hand on the stove last time and it burned me. Maybe it won't next time. Well, you shouldn't do that because it probably will. Well, how do you know that? Like you couldn't function in the world without assuming that the future will resemble the past. Yeah, like, and so it's not real. I mean, if you want to call that a faith claim, okay, but it is not a faith claim that it is at all irrational to make. And it is not that the future will resemble the past is not at all in the same category as other faith claims like Jesus rose from the dead or God exists, or like these are totally different things that you can function in the world without, that you're not insane for doubting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like totally different categories. So you can't use well, you have to take induction by faith, and so therefore all these other things are okay to believe by faith. No, totally different categories.
Yeah, exactly. It's sloppy thinking on the part of critics, who come at science that way. I mean, I've always looked at it that way. It's pretty sloppy thinking.
It's the fallacy would be called straw man. They're making science into something that it is not to make it easier to attack. They're trying to make it into a religion, right? To make it easier to attack when it's.
Oh, sure, fair enough. I was thinking along the lines of a false equivalency.
Yeah, it's yeah.
I mean, but I get your logic on that. Hey everyone. We are deep into critical thinking in our podcast, and guess what? My guest has actually put together 2 different courses around this topic on my favorite learning platform, the Great Courses Plus. That's right. Big Questions in Philosophy and Science Fiction as Philosophy are courses you can do right now on the Great Courses platform, where Kyle will walk you through these involved topics step by step. And those are just 2 of thousands of the courses available to you. In case you've not heard of this before, the Great Courses Plus is a streaming service with an extensive course library which enables you to educate yourself on nearly any topic imaginable. From enhancing your cooking skills to getting a better understanding of your finances, improving your response to stress and anxiety, and so much more. You can even use the Great Courses Plus to supplement homeschooling. Have your kids learn math, science, history, and art from some of the best teachers out there. All of the content is objective and fact-based and easy to access anytime, anywhere using the Great Courses Plus app. So don't wait any longer. Sign up for the Great Courses Plus today. I've arranged for my listeners to get a full month of unlimited access for free. To start your free month trial, sign up today using my special URL. Go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/critical. Remember, thegreatcoursesplus.com/critical. Sign up today. Okay, I have a different question for you because I realize now, you're a teacher. How long have you been teaching?
I've been at Kingston 15 years, and then I taught, various classes at the University of Oklahoma when I was in grad school for about 3 or 4 years.
And do the students who come into your classes, are these people who have been already pretty thoroughly indoctrinated in this stuff, or are your classes sort of their first or second look into this subject?
First or second. I teach intro. My big question course is what I use to teach intro at King's, and so those are people who have never had intro to philosophy before, any exposure to philosophy, unless I happen to. I used to teach a basic freshman level course that was kind of basic critical thinking. Unless they had me for that, they get a little bit of introduction. But usually my intro students have not seen philosophy at all. And then I also teach a second level philosophy course called Pop Culture and Philosophy. I teach logic as a second level philosophy course. A few others like that. And those are like, they've had intro with somebody, maybe not me, before they get to my pop culture class, which like sci-fi, I teach a version of sci-fi. That's the second philosophy course. Also, there's my newest book, Black Mirror in Philosophy. Last semester, I guess it's now 2 semesters ago, last fall, I taught a course based on the Black Mirror in Philosophy book. But that was all people, most of them who had intro.
Wow. Black Mirror. You must have loved that first episode.
Oh, I always tell anyone who's never seen Black Mirror to not watch the first episode first, because it just turns so many people off because they think the whole series is like that, and it's not.
Exactly. I blew off that series for about 3 years after watching that first episode. That was crazy town. I do not ever want to watch anything like that ever again. So, but I grew to appreciate after I got enough people telling me, oh no, man, you got to check out the rest of these episodes. I was like, oh, okay. And then I just binged everything because the rest of them were amazing.
Yes,
but that first one was dark. Whoa.
Yes, it is. But it is one of my favorites. Like, I tell people to avoid it, to watch it first, but it is still one of my favorites. It is just so brilliant. It's so good. It's
quite smart. It is.
You would really enjoy the first chapter in the book on that. So the book dedicates a chapter to each episode.
Ah, cool.
And then has six chapters at the end. They're kind of about the series as a whole, but it dedicates a chapter to each episode. You would absolutely love the first chapter of the book on that episode. I'll relay just a little bit, and then we get back to critical thinking. Just a little bit. One of the things that I discovered when I was editing the book is that Charlie Brooker, before Black Mirror, was kind of known for doing comedy. And so when this first episode got the press screening that it did, and I won't spoil anything about the episode, but people who know what I'm talking about will know what I'm talking about. When they did the press screening of the episode and the kind of plot is revealed in the first scene about kind of what's being threatened and what's right, people started laughing. They were like, oh, Charlie Brooker again doing his crazy comedy or whatever. And so when it comes to the big moments, when the prime minister is going to do what he does, right, and there are people watching in the bar and that kind of stuff, the press corps, like the people in the room watching the premiere of the episode, were acting just like the people in the bar and the different places in the episode, where they were like, all right, I can't believe we're going to watch. This is crazy. This is going to be so great. And then as it happens in the room with the press corps, the same exact thing happened with them as happens with the people in the episode. There is this slow, calm realization of, not calm is not the right word, of, can I swear?
Yeah,
Oh my fuck, what am I watching? And what have I done? And how have I participated in it? And is this really who I am? And is this really what we are? And it is, all the blood leaves your face. The same thing happened in the room when they were watching the premiere as happens in the episode. And the producers were like, we nailed it. This is the mood. This is the tone of the entire series. This is what we want. It's just brilliant. And that comes up in the book, and about like why Brooker did what he did in that episode, of what it accomplishes, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, good stuff. Anyway,
I will definitely take my hat off to him as a writer, producer, show maker or runner or whatever his specific role is there. Yeah, they nailed it, and it nailed it in a way that was the most squirming, uncomfortable experience you could possibly have watching this thing. And like the show says, Black Mirror, it's a mirror, it's not a very light mirror.
Yes.
It's a dark one, it's a dark show. Okay. So now I wanted to ask you on a completely different subject, much lighter, maybe. What do you find, and I'll just ask the question. What do you find in your new students routinely that come in to learn about critical thinking? They've had this education. They've been stuffed with years of knowledge. They supposedly have this idea, they have math skills and certain skill set that they can, that they can approach life with. Now they're in college. They're coming to you. Okay, how do I think better, Doc? Right. And they have whatever issues they've got, and I'm curious what those issues are. What do you find as a teacher?
So I'll say a couple things about what they come in with, and then what they think about the class, like what they're at the beginning, at the end of the course. So at the beginning, I very often find students, not all obviously, that are indoctrinated. Not indoctrinated is not the right word, but are replete, are saturated with, are constantly exposed to, and believe a lot of pseudoscience, a lot of nonsense, a lot of what James Randi would call flim-flam, right? That they're into a lot of it. They believe a lot of it, and a lot of it comes from them watching YouTube videos all day. Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok or whatever, right? Just the kind of constantly being berated with bullshit, and they fall for a lot of it. I used to do, when I taught the basic freshman level critical thinking class, I used to do a survey of what they believed before and after the class. And consistently, I found that like 80% of them believed in ghosts.
Wow.
Usually
just coming in.
Yeah, just coming in. Like 80% of them would believe in ghosts. And usually the reasons they cited were things like, well, didn't you see paranormal activity? Like, or ghost hunters or whatever, right? Like, but even paranormal activity, like a movie is fictional, right? That's like saying, I believe that Luke Skywalker is real because I watched Star Wars, right? But they don't understand the distinction between, like, because, well, it looked like it was from a house cam or whatever, so it must be real. Or be like believing in witches because you watched the Blair Witch Project, right? Like, just, right. And so they come, I've had flat earthers in the class.
That must have been a challenge. You had flat earth students?
Oh yeah. I've had flat earthers in my classes before.
Wow.
And, I've had conspiracy theories of all stripes coming from students.
Yeah.
And from that to students who think that magicians actually have magic powers. That they don't understand that it's tricks, that it's illusion, that it's sleight of hand. Like, they actually think that, like, Chris Angel really actually has supernatural abilities.
Wow.
And so again, with ghosts, it's like 80% of my students. I wouldn't say the percentage of people who are into, who think that is pretty low. But I remember specifically having a student that I was trying to teach this fallacy that I identify as the mystery, therefore magic fallacy. It's a variety of appealing to ignorance. And I usually do it in class actually, I started doing this after this. So I would just use the example of, like, everyone knows that magicians aren't really pulling off, don't really have supernatural powers, they're just doing tricks. But of course, when they do them, you can't explain it, but that doesn't mean that they have supernatural powers. And I had a student that was like, no, they have magic powers. They really can do this, right? And she mentioned Chris Angel specifically as someone. And so I had to find an interview with Penn and Teller and Chris Angel, where Chris Angel just flat out admitted, yes, it's all tricks. Here's how I do them, right? Like, in order to, and it still didn't really stick. Like, that's how deep it can go sometimes, right? How deep the illusion and how deep the misinformation and that kind of stuff can go. But when I've done my surveys after the course is done, right? A lot of those beliefs come down quite a bit, right? Ghost usually stays still at like 20-25% or whatever. But it was the highest to begin with, so that's not too surprising. But the course can certainly eliminate things like belief in Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster and that kind of stuff. But one of the things that I have realized in doing this is that critical thinking is not like, one of the reasons that you can't just argue someone out of a belief initially and then they'll just change their mind is because they really have to understand and appreciate what critical thinking is and the value of it, and actually value having true beliefs. Like, they have to actually care about believing what's true and not just what they want, right? Because if they don't do that, then you could argue with them all day and it's not going to matter, right? You can have the best argument, and if they only care about believing what they want, they're never going to change their mind. You have to get them to care about truth and then give them the skills to get there. And that takes a lot of time. It takes, like, I could teach the same content I teach over a whole semester and try to squeeze it in 2 weeks and it wouldn't have the same effect. Critical thinking is something that you have to, like, live with, and it has to kind of stick with you every day. And you're thinking about the stuff that we talk about in class, and you see how it applies in real world situations. And you have conversations with friends over a month or two, and you realize the kind of mistakes that they're making, and you're able to recognize them. And you're constantly digesting and thinking about it. And so by the end of the semester, right, you have a real appreciation of it. And so, to your question, like, how do the students react to it? A lot of the students react to it by saying, why the hell did someone not teach me this before? Why didn't I learn this in high school? Why did I not learn this in science class? Why did I not learn this in other places? Why is this only taught to me here and now? I could have used this. And more specifically, why isn't everyone taught this?
Right.
This is a course that should be required of everyone who gets a college education anywhere, right?
Which I'm now going to interrupt because I want to ask you, your courses are elective?
Actually, my philosophy courses are not.
Okay.
But every King student is required to take 2 philosophy classes. We have 6 philosophers on staff, so they don't necessarily have to take it with me. But King's is dedicated. King's is very dedicated to philosophy as a necessary part of liberal arts education, and just see its value. One of the mantras at King's is we not only teach you how to make a living, but how to live. Part of that how to live is becoming a functioning member of society, a functioning contributing member of society. And King's recognizes the necessity of philosophy to that, and specifically the critical thinking abilities that you get with that. And critical thinking is kind of taught in multiple ways in multiple classes. Although, I mean, I would argue that, I'm the kind of the local expert on critical thinking, and so I think they get the heaviest, most rigorous version of it in my courses. The critical thinking course I taught to freshmen wasn't required of all. That particular course was required, but of course you could take it with a bunch of different people, and a bunch of different people taught it a bunch of different ways. It was just called liberal arts seminar, so it wasn't necessarily dedicated to critical thinking. I just dedicated my version to it.
Okay. Well, where I'm going with that is that there's an assumption in society. This is clear cut. I am not like having to infer some strange piece of information here. There is most definitely this idea amongst, certainly in America, I can't speak internationally, that if you have a doctorate, if you're a doctor of anything, you got, you got PhD or MD after your name, you know how to think. And that just empirically ain't true.
That is correct.
Now, it seems that these kinds of classes we all assume are on the lineup.
Right. And they're not. They're not. Let me give you.
How is that a reality in our modern age?
Well, it's because people do not fully appreciate the importance and necessity of a direct critical. Okay, so I'm going to go off here. All right. So let me give you an example of myself that you are right. I have a PhD in philosophy with a specialization in logic, and I really did not learn critical thinking until afterwards, until I got to King's and had to teach critical thinking and read Schick's, how to think about weird things book, and started I could do the predicate calculus. I could do that kind of the mathematical part of it. I could do all of that. There's some fallacies I recognize and that kind of stuff, right? But hardcore critical thinking with scientific reasoning, with massive knowledge of fallacies and how to avoid them, and how to apply it to everyday life, and to debunk things like ghosts and conspiracy theories and that kind of stuff. I didn't get that by studying logic as a PhD. I got the predicate calculus as that, and I could do that kind of stuff, but I didn't get that until I was teaching it in the real world, right?
You had to become a critical thinking teacher before you really got this under your belt as a martial art. You're ready to go out and chop people's illogic.
Right. Now I've been doing it for 15 years, so I'm really good at it now. But right, I didn't get that as a PhD. And not to knock University of Oklahoma or anything like that. It's a marvelous program, right? And it did exactly what it was supposed to do: teach me logic and that kind of stuff, right? But it's there, and this happens everywhere. A lot, and there's a webpage I could link you to, I think, that makes this argument. There's a lot of people who think they teach critical thinking, but don't. Not in the way that you and I are talking about critical thinking.
Let's talk about
that.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, so for example, you might get someone who teaches a literature class and thinks that they're teaching critical thinking because they're having their students think critically about the text.
Oh, in terms of literary criticism or something.
Like literary criticism, or even thinking about if the text is presenting an argument, they want them to evaluate the argument. So let's think critically about this. And so we try to evaluate the argument, that kind of stuff. And there's a little bit of critical thinking involved there, right? But that way of teaching critical thinking is not nearly as effective as a course dedicated to critical thinking, that teaches specifically these kinds of reasoning, these kinds of arguments work, these don't. Here are the fallacies. Here's how to spot them. Here's what their names are. Here's why they are fallacious. Here are the reasons that you should care about actually having true belief. Here's the reasons that the objective reality is actually a real thing that we can actually get to. Like doing all of that and doing it formally and doing it rigorously and testing specifically on it, that does so much more than we're going to think critically about this text. We're going to think critically about. And there's a society dedicated to critical thinking that actually has studies on this, where like you will have professors who think they know how to think critically and think that they're teaching critical thinking to their students. And then when you give them tests about critical thinking, they fail, right? They don't know what it is and they don't know how to teach it, right? And so we've kind of fooled ourselves, I think, in a lot of ways, into thinking that we're teaching critical thinking when we're not, because we don't require a course that is dedicated to critical thinking in the way that the kind of courses I'm talking about are. We don't require that of all students. And as evidence that that's the case, right? Like you can look at my students who've taken all of these other classes, right? And then come to my class and like, this is a revelation. I've never seen anything like this before. I've never been taught anything like this before. And I'm a science major and I've never learned anything like, right? Like specifically at King's, I've got friends in the science department who complain about the fact that they've got science majors, chemists, biology majors, and that kind of stuff, who go through and they're really good at doing chemistry, at doing like physics, at doing immunology or whatever it is, right? Like the specific thing that they've learned, they're really good at that, but they believe in Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and think ghosts are real, right? Like, right? And they're like, what are we doing wrong? And what you're doing wrong is that you're teaching them how to do this particular kind of science without teaching, like, in general, scientific thinking, the inference is the best explanation that I've been talking about, right? And thinking about how to apply that not only to what they're doing specifically in whatever branch of science that they're in, but how to apply it everywhere. Right?
Exactly. And
get a rocket scientist who believes, right, that Bigfoot's real or something like that, right?
Well, exactly, and that's what we see. That's what we hear. We get Dr. Oz. We get Mr. Phil. We get these guys who I'm just going to call him Mr. Phil because fuck that guy. But
Doctor, right.
I don't think he's actually a doctor.
No, he's not.
And yet they call themselves this, right? These are I cite them as two of the biggest peddlers of pseudoscience and nonsense that we've seen in American culture. Thank you, Oprah.
Yeah.
Who she seems to be like, kind of Trump-like in the way she seems to dodge any responsibility for having inflicted this upon the nation. But we also get from that this assumption, right, that we see through society that these are authority figures merely because we call them doctor.
Right.
Because we have MD after their name. And admittedly, medical doctors have to learn a whole lot of crap. They got 8 years of schooling. I mean, some 12. I mean, it's tremendous amount of facts that are packed into their noggins. I looked up at the lineup for a neuroscientist, and it's scary. It's formidable what they have to learn in order to be that. But critical thinking isn't anywhere on that lineup.
Isn't on the list. Yep.
So you wonder, how is such a thing possible? So you're in academia. Please explain to me. I'm not trying to make you an apologist for academia. I'm just consulting your experience as an educator.
Right. Well, there's a couple things. In a certain kind of way, I've answered this question. What we fooled ourselves into thinking that we are when we're not. Right. Think that we're giving them critical thinking without having a class dedicated to it, because they critically think about text and they critically think about science and they critically think about, they're doing critical thinking in all of their classes. And so we don't need a course dedicated to it, right? When what they're doing in those other classes is not really the kind of critical thinking that I'm talking about here. And it's not possible to really do that kind of critical thinking without a course dedicated to it, right? Part of it is just practicality, right? Like one of the problems that I have at King's and ever arguing that we need to make a critical thinking course required of everybody is just they're so overloaded with so many other classes, right? There's so many things, so many courses that you have to take for certain majors and that kind of stuff. They just don't have any room to cram anything else in, right? But to that, like, a little ray of hope. Let me just tell you just a little story. So In the article I mentioned earlier that I said I had an article in a book on medical error, which again, I'll give you the link for that you can link to it below. In that article, I argue that the medical literature does not appreciate what medical diagnosis is, and specifically what kind of reasoning is employed in medical diagnosis. If you look at the medical literature, they talk about system 1 reasoning and system 2 reasoning, and Bayesian reasoning comes in now and again, but there's not kind of a unified kind of view of what diagnostic reasoning is. And so what I argue in the paper is that actually what all diagnostic reasoning is inference to the best explanation. The symptoms are the thing that you're trying to explain, and the diagnosis is the explanation for why they have the symptoms. And when you do a diagnosis, you're considering multiple explanations and accepting the best one. And that inference to the best explanation is a well-defined and understood process that has those 5 criteria that Schick talks about. The criteria are testability, fruitfulness, scope or explanatory power, simplicity or Occam's razor, and then conservatism. Does it align with what we already think is true? And that you figure out what's the best explanation by figuring out which one meets the most criteria. And that's what diagnostic reasoning is. And so that if you wanted to make a concerted effort to reduce the number of misdiagnoses and those kind of medical errors, teach doctors critical thinking. Teach doctors how to do inference to the best explanation and all the reasons it works and all the criteria and what they mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you will improve their diagnostic skills, right? And so, that's essentially the essence of the paper was if you want to, make doctors better at diagnosis, teach them this kind of basic critical thinking method of reasoning, right? Well, around the time I was publishing that article, we have a really good, powerful, very well-respected PA program at King's, physician assistant program at King's. And the director came to our department chair and basically said, not that they were bad, but I want our students to be better at diagnosis. And I think that critical thinking would get them there. What happened to the critical thinking course? The critical thinking course went away and became a Liberal seminar, right? And so the department chair had to say, well, critical thinking isn't around, but if you're interested in this, right, like Dr. Johnson just published a paper. Well, he didn't actually know about the paper at that point, but he's really passionate about critical thinking. He might be able to help you out. And so she came to me and I was like, oh yeah, I got a paper about this and I am all into this. If you want a course kind of dedicated to, teaching critical thinking to these PA students and specifically, like medical students, whatever, I am all over that. And so I developed this course I called SPMR. It's Scientific, Pseudoscientific, and Medical Reasoning, SPMR. Scientific, Pseudoscientific, and Medical Reasoning. And essentially, it is geared towards people in the medical field, not just PAs, but anybody. And really, anybody can take it. And to teach them how to recognize science, how to do and think scientific, how to do science and think scientifically, how to recognize pseudoscience when you see it, right? And we cover my paper about diagnostic skills, et cetera, right? And I taught it for the first time last semester. And of course, in the middle of last semester, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, right? And I said, guess what? This is the most important class you've ever taken, right? Everything that we've been talking about is now directly applicable, and it's the most important damn thing in the world right now.
Yeah.
Right? How to detect medical pseudoscience and how to tell when people are involved in conspiracy theories and that kind of stuff. This is why everyone needs to take this kind of class, is because it is the most important thing in the world.
Well, our society seems especially prone to accepting conspiracy theories and crazy pseudoscience. Again, I can't speak to the international scene. I don't know anything about pseudoscience in China or India, how prevalent it is, what brand of it they engage in. That they do it is a certainty to me. But
it definitely exists. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can't speak to it, right? American culture, I'm steeped in it and all about it. So, and we are surrounded by it. I mean, the flat earthers. I've been to a flat Earth convention, an international flat Earth convention, by the way. People have to fly to it, right, over the flat Earth, and then present their evidence about that they just flew over a flat Earth, not a round Earth, right?
Right.
So, these types. And there's a lot of Americans, and you just go, okay. You've had people show up in your class with these things. So in a nutshell, and this is awful for me to do because you do have an entire program on this. You got this huge PowerPoint on it. You've done you have a whole unit on this. But for the audience, right, in terms of like key points or things that they're listening to this podcast for, what are the markers or the immediate things you can just go, okay, pseudoscience, just boom. I don't even have to look at anything else. I don't have to go dive into studies. I don't have to do a 10-hour research project, deep dive. That is pseudoscience.
Yes.
How do you know?
Okay. So, I mean, there is nothing that quite fits the bill that you're describing that will tell you 100% of the time that you are doing pseudoscience. The only kind of way to really do that is to learn abduction, to learn inference to the best explanation, and then just learn how to do it. And you just recognize what science is. And then you can, what science is, you recognize what it isn't. That's the only kind of way to do that. But there are a number of what I call red flags that if you see it, you can likely just walk away from it. No, like you can just label it as pseudoscience and walk away with it. And 99% of the time, you're going to be right. Probably even more often than that, right? And so the kinds of things I'm thinking about are does it only rely on testimonials, right? Is it just I took such and such and then I got better, therefore it works? If it's only doing that, most likely it's pseudoscience. If there's been no advancement in the knowledge, like if it's been the same for thousands and thousands of years, there's been no advancement in knowledge, like astrology, right? That's going to very likely be a pseudoscience. Or if it's similarly, if it's based on ancient knowledge, that's going to be pseudoscience. The fact that something's been around a long time is not a good reason to think that it's actually true. That's just a good reason to think that people have been stubborn for a long time. Like knowledge usually changes, like true knowledge changes over time. It updates itself, right? If you see that they've got money to make, if they're trying to sell you something, or if they've got an agenda, that's going to be a big red flag that you're dealing with something that's pseudoscience. Always try to make sure that people have got the appropriate pedigree, that they've got the appropriate credentials to be talking about what they're talking about.
Now, on that point, let's talk about that one for a second, because a lot of people bought into these Bakersfield doctors going on at a mad rate about the COVID-19 and how the numbers don't add up and how, the infection rate's not really that high and we're overreacting to what's going on. These are a couple doctors who work at an urgent care, and I'm not trying to, in any way, shape, or form, take away from their value to society as medical doctors working at an urgent care. That is an important function. They serve a valuable purpose, and I want them there. But I don't particularly think that they're the two people I should be listening to about a pandemic, which is an entirely different discipline of medical science from fixing up a body at an urgent care.
Yeah.
So that might be a non-obvious example of pedigree, because people buy into this. Well, he's a doctor. Fucking Joe Rogan pushed this shit. And it obscenely pissed me off, right? Because it's like, this is a guy who has had immunologists, epidemiologists on his show.
Right.
He of all people should not be so irresponsible as to say all doctors are the same as all doctors. And yet that's exactly what he's doing. So I find
it's a real easy. Go ahead.
I just find it very objectionable. So that being so, kind of getting off my soapbox for a second. That's the first thing that occurred to me just now, because so many Americans, so many people have bought into that because they're doctors. So on that pedigree point, how do you? Is it enough? It's clearly not enough that they just have MD after their name.
Right, absolutely, right. No, you have to, and it takes some effort, right, to figure out whether or not their pedigree is in, or their degree is in the right field to be talking about what they're talking about, right? And if they're completely divorced, right, if you've got a weatherman talking about astrophysics, he's outside of his area, his expertise, and that's really easy to see. It's easy to see, and so you shouldn't just trust his word on that, right?
Yep.
But if you've got, like, a really famous example of this is Linus Pauling, who was a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. That everybody thinks that taking vitamin C boosts your immune system. but taking vitamin C does not boost your immune system, but everybody thinks it does because Linus Pauling said so. And Linus Pauling was a Nobel Prize award-winning chemist. Well, guess what? Chemistry is not immunology. Two totally different branches of science, right? And so the fact that he's a chemist does not make, even Nobel Prize-winning chemist, does not make him qualified to speak on immunology. But because they're a little bit more closely related than like weatherman and astrophysics, right? People are more easily make that decision. And the more kind of closely related the topics are, the more easy it is to make that, right? And so immunology is much more closely related to, a medical degree, right, than a weatherman or whatever, right? Like, or a chemist in Linus Pauling's case, right? But still, it's not related enough. It's not close enough. An ER doctor, for example, does not have the relevant expertise to crunch the numbers and do the data and that kind of stuff to figure out what an infection rate actually is, right? To be aware of all the statistics and all the kind of stuff you need to be aware of and how infectious disease works, like that kind of stuff. They're not, especially like a surgeon or something like that. A surgeon is just an engineer, like a human engineer, but they don't have the kind of specialized knowledge and that kind of stuff to do immunology and figure out infection rates and how careful we need to be, et cetera, right? And so, but it's just because they both have doctor in front of their name, it's real easy to make that mistake. But we have to be vigilant, we have to be careful and figure out whether or not people actually have the right pedigrees. And that's just something that you have to do with experience. You just have to be careful about who you listen to and figure out, well, what is their degree really in, and are they really qualified to be talking about this, right? And it just takes, you have to be careful, and it takes experience to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I get a little jacked about it because it's just sloppy thinking. But I don't want to. But I also know that I spend an awful lot of time thinking about this, learning about this stuff, and I probably unfairly, blanket my knowledge onto other people and say, well, it's common sense. Come on. And that's why I wanted to ask you about the incoming students, because I'm sure there are times when you must just think to yourself, holy cow. I mean, flat earthers, that's a rough one, because the other problem with pseudoscience is that it's not hard to debunk, but it's hard to get people who believe in it to listen to your debunk.
To change their mind, yes.
Yeah. Actually take you seriously because of all the cognitive biases that jump into the fray. Which then leads me to my next question to you, because clearly you do get results over time. And as you mentioned, it takes time, weeks, months of exposure to this material to start really changing thinking patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Rewiring brain. That's what you're doing when you're teaching somebody stuff. So it does take time. It takes repetition. It takes concentrated active thinking in order for them to be able to do that. So how do you deal with those kind of students who come in? I mean, clearly the path is not, okay, everybody laugh at this guy. He's a flat earther. That's not going to fly. You're never going to change. Never going to get them willing to listen to what you have to say if you're at that point. So how do you? I mean, I'm just going to sort of assume right now you have the patience of a Mother Teresa or something. But how do you deal with that level of crazy?
So don't let me go off on Mother Teresa. But I don't have enough. I don't have as much patience as I should, right? That it has gone badly in class sometimes when I've got a student that won't back down or whatever, right? On something, but usually for one, I won't bring it up early on in the semester. I will wait to tackle those kinds of issues until we have gone over and they have the skills to deal with them. And so that early on, I'm just kind of teaching these basics, and I'm just kind of teaching that's why your perception is not all that reliable. This is how you do this. This is how you think this way. And this is what the criteria mean, et cetera, et cetera. And then once they've got those skills, then we start digging into ghosts and ESP and blah, 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 right? Creationism and that kind of stuff, right? And by that time, they've got the skill set to do it. And so they're already kind of doing it on their own, which if you really want to convince somebody to believe something, that's how you do it. You get them to reason to the conclusion themselves. You don't reason them to that. You give them the skills. They figure it out themselves, and then they'll be convinced by their own argument, right? And so usually by the time we're hitting that stuff, a lot of the students will have the ability to figure it out on their own. And so they won't make this kind of mistake in class. When they do make that kind of mistake in class, usually what I at least try to do is back up and go, okay, all right, let's think about this. Let's apply the criteria. You say such and such, right? That's one hypothesis. What's another possible explanation for what's going on here, right? So, for example, if they believe in ghosts, right, and they say, well, but one time me and my friends were blah blah blah, and they give me some kind of story, right? I say, okay, so that's what happened. All right. So one possible explanation for what you experienced is it was a ghost, right? Can you think of another possible explanation for what was going on there, right? And usually they're able to produce something. If they can't, then I ask the class, can anybody else think of another possible explanation for what's possibly going on there, right? And I'll get some kind of alternate explanation, right? And they'll say, okay, let's apply the criteria, right? Like, what evidence do we have? And then which is the simplest explanation? Which is the most parsimonious? Or excuse me, that was repetitive. Which has wider scope? Which has more explanatory power? Which one more aligns with what we know to be true, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll go and we'll see that this new hypothesis clearly is the better hypothesis, right? And I'll just say, okay, so like clearly it looks like that's the more rational thing to believe. If you still believe this, I can't stop you from doing that, right? But you have to recognize that it looks like you're dismissing what kind of clearly is the better rational explanation, right? And you can't expect other people to think that that's right,
yeah, good,
right? And usually, I mean, they won't admit it right then or whatever, right? But they will break out of it. And a great example from just this semester in which class was it? I think it was in my logic class. Girl's name was Sabrina. And she had watched the last episode of the Netflix series on Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah.
And in that last episode, they essentially have a psychic medium show up and do readings and stuff on people. And she was wholly convinced. She was like, you got to watch this episode, da-da-da-da-da-da. And this is really early on in the semester. And I was like, okay, but I'll tell you what, I will talk to you about this, but we need to get a little bit further in the class before we're going to talk about it. Because there's some things you need to know, and there's some skills you need, and there's some things I need to teach you before you're really able to like really examine what's going on here, right? And so I watched it, and then I told her, like, I'm not convinced. And I kind of told her some reasons why, and she was kind of like, oh, but I really think it's real, blah, 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 blah. By the end of the semester, she came back and was like, I cannot believe I was so stupid. It was obvious to her after getting the skills that she got in the class, right? It took a little time. It took a little digesting. It took a little some examples of applying it to other things or whatever. And she eventually came around. But I didn't berate her. I didn't like, oh, you're dumb, you're whatever. All right, it was just like, I'll watch it, and say I'm not convinced, and here's why. And let's anyway. So it can work, but it just takes a lot of time, and it's not something that you can do. And I should learn this. It's not something that you can do on Facebook over, right? Like it's yeah.
I have to admit, it has been too recently that I have come to learn myself for real, even after preaching it for years, the futility of trying to change hearts and minds online only through text messaging. It's just, but I have to also say at the same time, I had started giving up on the idea that critical thinking education alone could solve this problem. And I don't know that it itself alone will, quote unquote, solve this problem of irrational thinking or belief in pseudoscience. But it seems to me, from what you're saying and your own experience from having taught this course, as its own discipline, not as something we're sort of sliding in with literary criticism or sort of putting in with chemistry or any other. I mean, lots of things require critical thinking, but learning the discipline of critical thinking, as we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, it is not natural to us to think that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it is something you have to learn and then discipline yourself to do. I'm encouraged by the fact that this, a 1 year class, a couple years class at a college level, and you really can get people thinking better. So imagine what we could do if we could take this and take it all the way down the school curriculum. And I know there are institutes and groups that are working on that, trying to get these kinds of classes implemented at lower levels. There have been curricula put together, there's textbooks, It's all there. It just needs to be pushed forward. What do you see as the future of this? Are you optimistic about it? What do you run into in academia as far as people wanting it, not wanting it, push back against it?
Um, Optimism or pessimism would require me to make a prediction about what's going to happen, and I'm usually squeamish about such things. So
Well, I guess I'm just kind of I not necessarily looking for a prediction of what's going to happen so much as I'm kind of wondering, as someone in this field teaching this in academia, are you encouraged by the environment you're in, that this is something that will continue and be and gain steam, or do you feel like, I'm getting great results, but I'm going in here and I don't even know if they're going to have this class next year because nobody's getting it.
yeah, it's not that they're not getting, the students aren't getting it. I get concerned with, as we talked about before, other academics kind of dismissing it as, oh, I do this in my classes too, so we don't need a class dedicated to it, right? I get discouraged by those kinds of notions. But I am also encouraged by things like the PA program coming and saying, we need a critical thinking class. And I say, damn right you do. And we do it, right? So there is some recognition there that it is needed. And that, that there are societies and stuff that are trying to, to get it taught at younger and younger levels, right? In my opinion, if we got it taught in high schools and then it was also reinforced in colleges, and then all the professors knew about it too, and they were able to apply it in all of their classes, it would, the nation would change, the world would change as a result, right? Because you wouldn't have you wouldn't have conspiracy theories running rampant. We would have somebody in the White House who endorses conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. You wouldn't have someone in the White House who thinks that if you take such and such and then you get better, the next cure is white. Like you wouldn't have those kind of mistakes being made. People would call them on it, realize that that's not somebody who should be an official, an elected official. The world would revolutionize. It honestly would. And like Bertrand Russell said that if I can remember the 3 rules, there's 3 kind of common sense rules, that if all the experts are agreed about something, the common man cannot say that they know better, that they know that the experts are wrong. If the experts are all agreed, if the experts disagree, the common person cannot know what's the case. And if the experts all agree that there's not enough information to settle the topic, somebody on the outside cannot say that, well, I know what the right answer is. And he says that if people just accepted those 3 basic things, that would revolutionize the world, right? Mm-hmm. And I think he's right about that, but I would go a step further and say that if people came to know and be able to evaluate what's good evidence and what's not, and what's a good argument and what's not, right? And everyone knew how to do that, right? The world would be even more revolutionized. I just wish that were the case, and I don't know if it will be the case. Again, there's some positive signs and there's some negative signs that we're moving in that direction, right? Maybe what we need to bring this all full circle is maybe what we need is more Spock, right? Like we need more logical role models in popular culture and in just general culture, right? People to look up to who champion this stuff, and they're the good guys in the movies, not the bad guys, right? And it's not seen as weird or they're quirky or whatever. Like there's some detectives that are this kind of way or whatever, and it's not seen as a design flaw. It's not seen as a character flaw, I should say, right? That it is something to emulate and is something to be proud of, right? That's one way pulp culture could help out anyway. But anyway.
No, I agree. I'm wondering if a slightly, well, kind of thinking right now, I was never a TNG guy, right? Never really big on Star Trek Next Generation. I was original series. That's how I grew up.
Okay.
Yeah, I was TOS, right? I was Kirk and Spock, and and that's, to me, that's Star Trek, and Rathacon. That's the epitome of everything that is beautiful about Star Trek. Then you get Data. You get Data, and in the new generation or Next Generation, and I think about what you were just saying, and I think, yeah, but the main thrust with that, with that character was he was always trying to be a human. And I thought, what a lost potential there, that he could have, been platforming critical thinking more and criticism of the human race rather than, no, the humans are the best species in the universe, which is the clear cut message of that show, which drives me absolutely crazy. I got a lot to say about Q, not the conspiracy, about the character in the show.
Right.
Okay, but it does lead me to my next question, which is, what would you say to people who, you being in academia, you knowing the scene behind the curtain, you knowing what actually goes on, and how the sausage gets made, so to speak. What would you say to people who say that the reason why critical thinking isn't being taught in schools is because there is a vast conspiracy by those in power to keep us all stupid?
Oh yeah, no, I don't think that that's going on. There's not a vast conspiracy. There's not a conspiracy to keep us all stupid. There again, there's that kind of misnomer about what critical thinking is, and that everybody's teaching it, that kind of stuff. Except for, I think that there's something to the idea that, like, education in general is kind of defunded, right? Like it doesn't get a lot of enough attention to it, and it's not seen as important enough, and people don't see it as a community good and a common good, social good, I should say. And so to that effect, there's less money to spend on it, and so there's less kind of flexibility, and that's where it's harder to have the kind of things like critical thinking taught whenever you're crunched for money and you're desperate for students. And so for example, right, like not everybody loves critical thinking, right? And so the more that colleges, for example, have to worry about their finances, the more they have to worry about like attracting students. And the more they have to worry about attracting students, the more appealing and fun the education has to seem to be, right? And if students don't like the fact that they're required to create critical thinking at your college, well, they're just going to go somewhere else where they don't have to take it, right? And so the kind of capitalization, right, to seeing education as a commodity, maybe fuels the idea, like it fuels a college is not teaching critical thinking because it's not as appealing to students. Students don't want to take it, right? And I say this as someone who, like, I teach pop culture and philosophy, right? I teach classes that are fun and attract students. My Black Mirror class filled out 3 sections. No, it was 2. No, it was 3 sections. I filled out 3 whole sections of Black Mirror last semester, and they'll fill out again next semester. And because it's a popular thing and it's fun and students want to take it and that kind of stuff, right? But it's like, I'm able, in that, I'm able to bring the value and bring the critical thinking and bring the philosophy and do all of that, right? But I'm kind of like tricking them in a certain kind of way, like I'm making this look fun, and it is fun, right? But we're going to get down and dirty. We are going to get, this is not going to be easy. We're going to really, like, you're going to really be challenged here and think critically and learn these kind of things. That's why when I taught my liberal arts seminar on critical thinking, I had things like the bizarre brain and the end of the world and that kind of stuff were the topics of these courses. Taught another one on Christmas, and people really liked that one. I have a book on that one too. Here's my Christmas book. But you don't want to do it at the expense of the education that you're receiving. And colleges who forego teaching critical thinking to attract more students are doing exactly that.
Right. So it really becomes more of a complex problem, as we seem to find routinely when we actually look into it, even just a little bit, trying to be explained by people who don't want to think with or don't have access to all the knowledge of what the complexities are. And so, we're going to think with a meme now. And
right.
It's bad men in dark, smoke-filled rooms twirling their mustaches and laughing at the common man as they oppress him and form slave states, and then before you know it, you're on Alex Jones's channel.
Yeah, well, see, and so here's the difference, though, right? Is that it's not a conspiracy theory, in that, like, it's not people smoking cigars and twirling their, like, to the extent that is being done, it's being done in public, right? It's no secret that Republicans in general are not friendly to education. They're not friendly to academia. They spin their own conspiracy theories about all of academia being a giant liberal conspiracy against them and blah, 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 right? And so they intentionally defund education. It's happening all the time. And they do it, like, you can find the bills and what they're doing, the laws they're enacting or whatever to do that, right? I can almost guarantee you that churches are going to get bailed out of the COVID pandemic before colleges are, right? Because they do not see value in what we're doing, and we don't teach the kind of things that they want us to teach, whatever they see us as biased and liberal and blah, 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 right? And so, like, there is a concerted effort against education in general to defund it and to make it seem not important. And so this, I mean, and that I think is what George Carlin was talking about when he has this kind of famous bit about, like, there's a big club and you ain't in it, right? And because there's people who really run the country and they do not want you to be educated. They want you to just have just enough education, enough to be a drone worker, but not enough to critically think and that kind of stuff, because people who critically think can't be controlled, right? And there's some truth to that, not completely. It's not a vast conspiracy theory. There's not the Illuminati aren't doing it or whatever, right? But there is a concerted effort against education in general in the country. And not to end on a down note, right? But the COVID pandemic, like, really looms large on higher education right now. And there's a lot of academics that are not sure that they're going to have jobs next year, right? And this is the horribleness of it, right? Like, it is a lack of critical thinking and a lack of appreciation for science that led this pandemic to be as bad as it is and to have the effects that it's having, right? And the result of it is going to be even more scientific ignorance and more, like, because it's going to decimate higher education. And so people aren't going to be getting the skills they need to prevent this kind of thing from happening again.
Exactly. And it's a bit of a vicious circle. And I wanted to sort of, in getting into this, I wasn't necessarily going in this direction, but now that it's come up, it reminds me that, even we blame these, men in smoke-filled dark rooms, but we're the ones who put them there.
Yeah.
And we have to, one thing that I was twigging on the other day is we have to realize that there's a codependent relationship there. The politicians stay in their jobs by telling us, their constituents, what they believe their constituents want to hear.
Yeah.
So when a politician, and most of these guys, especially when you get to the level of federal, but certainly at the state level, which is where these guys mostly come from, you're talking about college educated people, some of them incredibly smart people. Ted Cruz, for all of his problems and faults, and they are legion, is a constitutional lawyer.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't just fall into that. That's not easy work to do. Those aren't easy papers to write. Those aren't easy arguments to make. And Ted Cruz did it. Now, who knows? Maybe he cheated his whole way through, but I'm just throwing him up as an example of, like, somebody that you wouldn't even expect is a highly educated man, but he actually is. And he's, I think, educated enough to know how to feed red meat to his base by telling them what they want to hear, which is, fuck those liberals, fuck those colleges, we don't need no education. And here he is, the product of years and years of education, knowing that that's what he needs to tell them, so they'll click on his name when voting time comes. So it becomes a sort of a self-generating, self-creating cycle. It's not them versus us. It's us putting them there and then them telling us what we want to hear.
Yeah.
That's a big part of this picture that never really gets talked about, certainly not in conspiracy circles.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's always them, not us, right? And I wonder if the unawareness of even that alone, that little societal phenomena, is enough to, it seems to perpetuate and keep this crap going. And it's just, we got to bust out of this somehow, because if we don't demand of them that we get these things, how is it that we possibly imagine that they're going to feel at all compelled or responsible to make it work for us to have those things?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
know I'm getting on a soapbox here, but I just, it's just this kind of, like, this is where the critical thinking is so necessary for the layman, for the common people, to see what's actually going on, and not this invented reality that we, of us versus them. And there's enough problems that are real of us versus them. We don't need to invent more. I
Right.
guess is where I go with that. I wanted to kind of throw that out there and see, what do you think about that? Do you think, as an educator and critical thinker, that I'm onto something there?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there is a segment of the population that votes that way and will vote for you if you tell them those kinds of things, right? There is definitely a segment of the population that likes it when you poo-poo academia, because academia doesn't tell you things that you want to hear, like that evolution is true, or that global warming is real, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And people know that, and people who know that evolution is true and global warming is real know that their constituents don't think that, and so they'll tell them what they want to hear to get them to vote, right? And a lot of that has to do with religion. A lot of, like, evolution obviously has to do with religion, but even global warming does. So a project I'm working on right now is a book. It's more pop culture stuff. It's a book on the Fox, Seth MacFarlane's The Orville. I don't know if you're familiar with The Orville.
Oh yeah, yeah, good show.
And so I'm working on a book on that. And one of my chapters in the book is on global warming. And there's this episode called "Should the Stars Appear" that is clearly an analogy about global warming and that kind of stuff. And one of the things I discovered in researching for that article, or for that chapter, was that global warming denial has become, and there's kind of a history for how this happened, but basically became a cultural phenomenon within the Christian church. So that to be a part of the Christian culture is to doubt global warming, to a degree that to even express any kind of, well, maybe they're onto something there, gets you ostracized from the community. And so it becomes part of their self-identity to be a Christian is partly to be a global warming denier. And there's something called, I'm sure you've heard of, called the backfire effect, right? Where you try to present evidence to someone, they'll just entrench in there. Well, it turns out that that's not always the case. If the belief in question is not important to the self-identity of the person, usually they will change their view. For example, if I tell you that the CDC warns against that there's E. coli in the romaine lettuce, so don't buy romaine lettuce at the store, people will say, okay, I won't buy romaine lettuce then, right? There's no problem. There's no, oh, it's a vast conspiracy. There's not ad hoc excuses. There's just, okay, I won't buy romaine lettuce until the CDC says it's safe, right? But if you tell an anti-vaxxer that the CDC says vaccines are safe, they will not believe you. Why? Because being anti-vax is part of their self-identity. So when you make being a climate change denier part of someone's self-identity, no amount of evidence in the world is going to make them change their mind, because that would mean that they have to change fundamentally who they are, and they're not going to do it. But the reason that's part of their self-identity is, in large part for most people, is because of their religion, right? And so religion plays a huge role in that. And so this is part of the GOP and their ability to take advantage of people's religious beliefs to make them vote the way they want to vote. They realize where those beliefs are and where the social cohesion is, where the social identity is, and they realize it's part of that. And so they appeal to that to get them all on their side, right? Same thing with abortion, right? Like, to take advantage of the abortion is to hijack that vote, right? Because being anti-abortion is so part of who people are. The same thing with being pro-choice too, is part of who people are, right? But yeah, so I think you're right that that's exactly what's going on with a lot of elected officials, that they're taking advantage of that and telling people what they want to hear to get their votes.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it definitely happens on both sides, but I think it happens on one side more than the other.
And I am, coming more and more to the place where I'm seeing more objectively. I'll never claim full objectivity, folks. I'm not, when I use this word, I use it in a sort of loosey-goosey sense. I mean, given everything we've already talked about in terms of perception and all that, I think you get where I'm coming from. But the most dangerous place is in the middle, because you get it from both sides.
Oh yeah, I see it.
Yeah, it sucks to be able to see critically the problems and flaws on both ends. It's so much easier, believe me, I know, to just adopt an extreme position and just invest all of your effort into it. It's a simpler life.
Yeah, because you lock yourself into an information bubble where you only have people who agree with you, and then you just hear your own opinions back to you, and you never disagreed with them. So it's very psychologically comforting and it's convenient.
Yeah, big time. And you get a lot of agreement, and you can be absolutely positively certain that you're right.
Yeah.
And no one can touch that.
Yeah.
And
That feeling of certainty is very comforting.
oh, it's amazing. There is definitely something instinctive there. There's something to that, that we have certainty, and I'm sure psychologically it's tied into deeply held beliefs that, that certainty is a need we have, not a want. I think there's something to that psychologically for sure. And then this manifests in groups, and when you get group behavior at that level, that's what we call a cult.
Yep.
And
yeah, we sure do.
That's right. And there you go. Anyway, I think we'll move to wrapping up at this point. But I can easily see inviting you back to talk about this more. I think there is so much fertile ground here and so much necessary things for us to talk about on this. I just don't think the message can get across enough in this day and age, especially with the amount of craziness and outright hysteria that we are seeing because of the misinformation that we are being fed by our media, by our churches, by our, even by our schools, by, our social clubs, by our book clubs, by our this, by our that. We've got to inculcate critical thinking as a necessary and vital life skill, for all of our citizens. And you're leading the way with that. You're a teacher of it. You're on there. So I validate the hell out of you for what you're doing and for the work and the time and effort that you put into what you do. It's super important, man.
Thanks. I try my best. I do what I can. It really is a big reason that I do what I do is that what philosophy did for me, even before I just learned critical thinking, but what philosophy did for me was it did break me from religion, for one thing. But it was like a light in the darkness that revealed the world and made me think about the world in a different way. And just it completely changed my life. And so I wanted to return that favor, essentially, by becoming a philosopher and teaching philosophy myself, so that I could have the same effect on my students that my professors had on me. And that critical thinking is a big, big part of that. Even though I didn't get that critical thinking necessarily from my professors because I got it afterwards, but that same kind of effect it still drives me, and I want to have that effect on my students. And I will say that, like, after teaching my science and pseudoscience and medical reasoning course this semester in the middle of a damn pandemic, I got lots of emails from my students saying, "Yep, I'm really glad I took this class. This is really, really important. It maybe made trying to live with my parents a little bit harder because they're indoctrinated and they're spouting conspiracy theories and they're doing that kind of stuff. And so it's made that a little bit more difficult living with my parents. But I'm really glad that I've got those skills so I can see through it and I'm not fooled. I'm not falling for the same kind of things that they're falling for. So anyway,
exactly. Cool, man. Well, listen, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. If you want to have me back, I only started my red flags of pseudoscience list. So we got plenty more.
It was funny, folks. We were actually going to spend most of the time talking about that. And then I totally derailed it by asking him all these other questions. And we just, because that's just how my podcast goes. So
it's all good. I'll come back and talk about the red flags. No big deal.
Absolutely, man. And I'll be glad to have you back. Folks, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback about this show, what we discussed, good, bad, or sideways, I would love to see it. Like I say, and it will continue to say, please just don't be insulting in communicating your bad feedback, if you have that, about what we've talked about here. I think if you are civil, then maybe we'll be civil back. And with that, we will come up to the end of the show. Also, my plug here, always, if you are enjoying the channel, if you're finding this educational, informative, and even slightly entertaining, then consider joining me on Patreon, because that is what keeps these lights on, keeps the show going, keeps me going and able to produce this content for you. So my Patreon account is linked below in the description section to this video. Or, of course, you can just send me some love through PayPal. That's always fun, too. All right, folks, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.